Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our seminar series for the Indigenous Research Support Network at JCU. So we've turned the tables on the usual chair today, and we actually have Associate Professor Sana Nakata, who's doing the presentation, and hence why I am chairing. So I'd like to begin the session, of course, by acknowledging I'm hosting this today from Gimoy, so I'm on the land of the Gimoy Wallamari Dingji people here on the south side of Cairns. I'd also like to acknowledge Naam, a Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, therefore where Prof Sana is presenting, and all of the traditional owners and country on the lands which are joining us today, including Bindal and Wongarugaba nations there and Bebegu Yamba campus. It's an auspicious week this week in the Indigenous calendar, and so I just like to acknowledge that it is Reconciliation Week, a time where we do remember those who fought for the hard-earned gains for the first referendum, also those stolen generations and the continued impact of oppression. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Monday is also Mabo Day as well. So important historic events this week. So it's very fitting that we have a reflection on Indigenous self-determination, and Prof Sana's talk today on what's time got to do with it. So just by way of those who don't know Professor Nakata, she's an associate professor. She's our head of research at the Indigenous Education and Research Centre. She is trained in law and political theory of the Western tradition and one of our very few Indigenous political scientists. And her research focuses on the politics of childhood, Indigenous policy and governance. She's had multiple ARC grants and written and edited books, including Childhood Citizenship, Governance and Policy. And she's published in leading international Australian journals and was also at the forefront of the, I guess, many academics participated at the time for the last year's referendum. So I just want to acknowledge your part in that as well, Prof Sana. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. We had a bit of a joke before about keeping to time, Prof Sana. So as a chair, I know how challenging that can be. We certainly want to provide an opportunity where you have a chance to engage in some dialogue and some questions as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Prof Sana.
So, Prof Felicia, and Watamuli, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out of your Friday. Really appreciate you continuing to engage with the IRSN, and in particular this series that we're doing this year that's looking at Indigenous self-determination. So Watamuli, and in the language of the Wurundjeri people whose land I'm on today, Wominjeka, and acknowledging elders past and present of all the countries where everyone is joining us from today. As Prof Felicia has already set out, last month Prof Martin Nakata set out the need for a new paradigm for thinking about Indigenous self-determination, particularly one that does the work of dislocating colonisation as a central reference point for Indigenous political life, and in that political life, our efforts to realise self-determination once again. So today I'm presenting some very early thinking on some key concepts that I'm finding useful for how we can begin to think through doing this work. I want to first set out an overview of existing ways in which we think about and have understood self-determination, particularly in Australia, and Indigenous self-determination, obviously, specifically. I'm then going to discuss and talk about two ideas that are particularly animating parts of contemporary political theory at the moment, which is the sort of discipline, I guess, that I've come up through in the academy. And those are complexity and temporality. I want to think about how these two ideas might help to dislocate or decenter the colonial present from our political analyses of Indigenous peoples and our pursuit of self-determination. And in doing so, I think you will hear the resonances of these ideas with cultural interface theory, and I want to draw some connections there. And then really I want to reflect on how we can show the different ways in which Indigenous self-determination is an area of study that really can't and shouldn't be analysed without rigorous engagement and understandings of time and the complex interactions between past, present and future, which colonial architectures, and I mean both the kind of institutional and structural arrangements of colonisation, but also the conceptual and knowledge paradigms that come with Western colonisation, tend to avoid. So let's get started, and I will also try and keep an eye on the time out of respect for everyone's busy schedules. Okay, so self-determination. So I'm going to talk through 4 ways of thinking about self-determination. First is in the Western tradition, self-determination emerges as a principle particularly grounded in individual understandings of autonomy, and that these understandings of individual autonomy form the basis of liberal democratic political communities. So it was expressed variously in the Peace of Westphalia, going back to the 17th century, and the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. In these documents, you read and can see the thinking around how a recognition that each individual human being is a self-determining being underpins a principle of collective consent of the governed, who in turn then, through their willing and collective consent, provide political legitimacy of the sovereign power. It's in this context of the so-called Enlightenment that the legitimacy of political communities, of nations, and later of states, in the sense that we know them today, comes to be grounded in this idea of the willing consent of individuals to come together and to exchange some limits on their individual autonomy and freedom for the protection of the community they choose to belong to from outsiders. So I don't need to say a lot to this audience, I think, about the irony and the hypocrisy in how these ideas emerge at the very same time that those empires, emerging empires, are engaged in the colonisation and dispossession of Indigenous peoples from around the world. The point that I want to make is that there is an interaction rather than a separation between these Western traditions of self-determination and the politics and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. So a quick example of how these ideas come together with respect to self-determination can be found in some of the political history of the Iroquois Confederacy in the place, Turtle Island, the place that we today call the United States of America. And while the historical analyses are contested still, there is an emerging acceptance and consensus that there was a very meaningful exchange of ideas between the American founding fathers and the generation of that Declaration of Independence and the political system of the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a confederacy of multiple Native American nations. And that it particularly and especially shaped ideas of federalism, which of course were the foundation of the emerging United States of America, and federalism is also something that the Australian political system is structured by. And this is just an example that's intended to remind us that Western political thought never emerged in a vacuum. It was never empty of an engagement with and understanding of Indigenous peoples and their political communities. And to suggest otherwise is to maintain an ahistoric treatment of Western political thought theory. It maintains an idea that political theory belongs to the West. And at the outset of today's presentation, I'm just going to say that it does not. So fast forward a few centuries then, And Indigenous self-determination comes to be expressed as a central principle and collective concept rather than an individual concept in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And again, at this audience, you'll be familiar with this declaration. It took decades to negotiate, and Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders played a significant and important role in shaping and the development and securing of that declaration. So Article 3 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and by virtue of that right, they are to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. And Article 4, which follows, stating that Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their international and local affairs. Now, these are broad and encompassing rights, which are not without their limitations and caveats in reality and in practice. Indeed, in negotiating the declaration at the United Nations, a key point of contention was actually between Indigenous peoples of the settler colonies and the African caucus, whose two experience of colonisations found themselves in the late 20th century at very different historic and political points. The former, as we know, encompasses a political reality in which autonomy from the colonial state is quite unlikely, while in the second, the African continent was grappling and continues to grapple with revitalising new forms of government following the formal exit of European colonial powers. So this really shaped how the right to self-determination was understood and debated and negotiated at the United Nations. A little bit more on this. So the non-Indigenous scholar, legal scholar Dylan Leno at the UQ distinguishes between external and internal aspects of self-determination. Externally, we can think of self-determination as the right of people to be free from external domination, while internally, self-determination suggests the right of people to freely choose their political regime, their political communities, and to be autonomous. So the internal aspect captures both the individual notion of self-determination, but also this manner in which Indigenous self-determination has predominantly been expressed, which is your right to belong to a distinctive political community. So in Australia, when we speak of Indigenous self-determination today, and certainly in the scholarship and in the politics scholarship, primarily it's used to reference a particular approach to policy and governance. And it's often used to describe this era from around 1973, when a significant amount of legislative reform post the 67 referendum starts to take hold. And McCorkadale's analysis from a number of years ago showed that between 1973 and 1986, the principle of self-determination was written into over 700 pieces of state and federal legislation and had 67 identifiable definitions in the Australian policy landscape. This is before the United Nations Declaration gets endorsed and signed off, right? So it's a really active discourse. It has a real purchase in the policy space, and it's really at that time describing efforts and trying to create arrangements in which Indigenous peoples have more say over the arrangements of how they're governed by the state. By the mid-1990s, following the backlash against Mabo and the diminishment of land rights into the property right of native title and the statutory native title framework, the self-determination era in this policy sense is understood to sort of really be sort of diminished. And political scientist Elizabeth Strakosch argues that what followed that period was, she describes it as a neoliberal policy era, in which Indigenous policy and governance shifts from self-determination principles and and efforts to enable Indigenous peoples and communities to have more control and say in the ways that they're governed. And I think that's important. Like, we're not talking about self-determination in the sense of sovereignty. In the policy sense, self-determination is really about being able to shape the terms upon which you're governed, rather than to assert a political autonomy in this more broad and encompassing sense that's expressed in the United Nations Declaration. But she talks about neoliberal policy as a shift from self-determination principles towards new governmentalities and technologies of individual behaviour and control. And one of the, I think, most clear examples of that is in, among other things, the cashless welfare debit card, right? And this attempt to use new tools and technologies to regulate and transform and condition individual behaviour. Okay, so this is how we see self-determination understood and thought about in politics and policy in particular. It has a particular narrative in the Western tradition. It has a different narrative in the Indigenous tradition. I've tried to make the point early on that those traditions are not separate, that they do have points of connection and interaction that we don't pay a lot of attention to, and that's something that I find really interesting. But what none of them really do is help us to understand what self-determination is for. And I think when we start to really take seriously what self-determination is for, how Indigenous peoples have expressed it, we start to get towards something a little less bureaucratic, a little less legalistic, and we are returned to what I'm going to suggest is a much more future-oriented concept. So I want to move to a position where it's possible to understand Indigenous self-determination as the right to determine our own futures once again. And to borrow the language of Prof Martin, that self-determination is the right to determine our own futures, whatever the changing determinations of others are. So to move to this point, sorry, I'm not sure what slides I should be on. Yeah, so to move to this point, I think we need to do a couple of things. Like I said, this is early thinking. But the first is that I think we actually have to start by historicising self-determination, by placing the concept back in time. And that's what I've tried to do with the Iroquois Confederacy example, because in rejecting the ahistoric treatment of self-determination within political theory, we actually are able to recover a much fuller account of how this concept was always and remains located within and shaped by imperialism and colonisation across the Americas in that example, but also into the Pacific and Oceania. But it also means, the second thing it means, I think, is that it allows us to take seriously the idea that self-determination has a political temporality. So the purpose of self-determination is about the right to create and belong to political communities in the present for the purpose of creating futures of our own making, even where those futures may remain inherently uncertain because of all manner of things, but in the present moment, in Indigenous research context, we can absolutely see the uncertainty that emerges as a result of a changing climate. And for Indigenous peoples, this particularly means, I think, self-determination for the purpose of creating futures that are our own and not reducible to a constant reaction to the colonial present or the colonial architectures of the day. And I'll say a little bit more about this as we move on. Okay, let me introduce complexity. So this is my task, to theorise self-determination as a future-making project rather than a legal project or a policy project. but actually as a future-making theme. And this is not, I have to be clear here, this is not about romanticising or idealising Indigenous futures. And I say that because I think we're seeing quite a lot of the use of the term Indigenous futures at the moment. And I think a lot of it is being used in this very romantic and ideal sense. We cannot simply determine, or we cannot simply declare our right to determine our own futures, call it Indigenous, and then all the while deny the material and structural realities of ongoing colonisation. I'm not suggesting that. I also don't want to suggest that by just imagining Indigenous futures, that somehow we have achieved the task of building a very serious theorisation of Indigenous self-determination that's going to be useful for what Indigenous communities need over the centuries to come. Instead, I'm trying to get to a point where if we seriously want to create the conditions in which Indigenous peoples are able to fully effect their right to self-determination, such that it can create futures that elide and escape and exceed the colonial architectures of today, then a lot actually has to change. That imagination is not enough. So here are two ideas that I'm working with to see where we can get to. The first is complexity. Complexity theory, as it's come into political theory, comes from scientific fields. Okay, and I think this speaks to the ways in which Western disciplines are seeking out new reference points beyond their own traditional boundaries. So this is an example where social sciences and political theory and philosophy have reached out to the natural sciences and theoretical sciences to think about the world we live in new ways. So it draws on scientific fields that are seeking to make sense of unknowable and unpredictable phenomenon. It's a departure from social scientific focuses on notions of what we might call things like dependent and independent variables. And I've been working with this idea in particular with Daniel Bray on a new article around thinking with children, which is currently under review. And in particular, we draw on William Connelly's work in A World of Becoming. He describes the world as made up of complex and open systems in which multiple fields of agency interact and overlap without a linear trajectory or inherent purpose, but always with an element of uncertainty. And I think this notion is shaping how I'm thinking about Indigenous self-determination. It's carrying over from one project into this one because it helps to see how we can dislocate colonisation and colonial reference points from the centre of our analysis. Complexity theory helps us, alongside other ideas and theories, to situate colonisation as one part of a complex and open system. It helps remind us that colonial structures are not determinative, right, and fixed, but actually that there is still openness, uncertainty, and contingencies through which new possibilities emerge. It provides a different universe in which to see, as Olufemi Táíwò asks of us in the African context, that we simply cannot define the colonised strictly by the colonial experience, and that that to maintain colonisation at the centre presents a method that is, and I quote from him, I think Prof Nakata quoted this last month too, historically suspect and has the unintended consequence of making less legible the autonomous lives, despite colonisation, led by the colonised. And so I think complexity theory would have us think about how to identify colonisation as a marker, but just one marker among many. It would not be a moment or a set of events or a set of structures so all-encompassing that it would overwhelm the agency of human beings. And I think that's a very fruitful point from which to escape some of the more structuralist commitments that pervade contemporary Indigenous studies. And I shouldn't locate it on Indigenous studies, but I can see how this is something that settler colonial theory really struggles with, and I think that complexity theory gives us a different kind of paradigm where we might be able to think ourselves outside of some of the cul-de-sacs that other traditions have are struggling with. Okay, time. Temporality. Okay, so what's time got to do with all of this? So I think temporality is part of complexity, which is that time becomes one of the scales that makes up a complex and open system. Temporality gives us a lot to consider about how Indigenous peoples, their politics, and their pursuit of self-determination have predominantly been treated in the social sciences. So where complexity theory highlights an opportunity for us to dislocate colonisation as a central reference point, engaging with temporality allows us to do other kinds of things. It reminds us, as I've already done today, to historicise the ideas that we're working with. It allows us to reveal how Western and colonial systems of thought and practice have located Indigenous peoples either in the past or outside of time, with implications for how we think then of Indigenous settler relations. And so this great quote from the first page of Mark Rifkin's book. He's a Native American scholar, where he says that Native peoples occupy a double bind within dominant settler reckonings of time. Either they are consigned to the past or they are inserted into a present defined on non-native terms. And so I think temporality begins to give us some tools both for understanding the ways in which Indigenous peoples are located and placed into linear timescales through Western knowledge paradigms, while recovering the agency of human people and Indigenous peoples within that. And alongside complexity, it helps us see that that can be one part of a much more complex constellation of understanding the pursuit of Indigenous self-determination. That is our capture, I guess, by colonial histories that Rifkin's talking about here is just one tiny node, one star in this complex temporal constellation. And it's something that I think another Nakata has described using different language and different terms as a cultural interface. So people here will know this work. But I think these are lovely quotes to consider. I won't read them for time. And when we read these quotes, when I read these pages, I see the language of complexity. I see the theorizing of complexity, of the pushing against linear and structurally deterministic concepts, of moving away from notions of cause and effect as a way of explaining current conditions or laying claim to new kinds of futures. And in its own way, there is a temporality in the work of Martin Nakata, I think. I don't know if he would agree. And I see it in particular late in his book where he's drawing on Foucault. I mean, he's writing this before William Connelly, before Mark Rifkin, before Olufemi Táíwò. But he's talking about notions of continuity and discontinuity. And he's talking about different ways through which we might consider islander relationships with different systems of knowledge, different historical trajectories for thinking about paths between the past and present. And I think whenever we see this language of how complex interactions between past and present, the kinds of futures that people are hoping to generate out of their work, this is where we see the temporal dimension of the work. And when it comes to Indigenous self-determination, and this is what makes this an early piece of thinking, this is not a completed empirical project, But we know from, Jeff Louis, who's done his master's with the IRSN with Prof Therese and Prof Felicia, there's a different way of reading histories of self-determination. There's a different way of identifying how self-determination is expressed by Indigenous peoples. And I guess my working hypothesis, and the one that shaped an ARC project that the team's got under review at the moment, is really this hypothesis that we can empirically study how Indigenous self-determination has been expressed by Indigenous peoples in different ways. And I want to suggest that complexity and temporality are useful tools for doing this. Sorry, I might just say a little bit more on, no, I'm going to run out of time. Okay, let's keep moving. Okay, so I want to suggest that if we bring these ideas together and analyse what Indigenous self-determination has been, was meant to be, by different parties and actors and institutions, what it could be again, we might find ourselves helpfully dislocating our analysis from the colonial presence. It directs us back to the historical tools and knowledges that we already have at our disposal to demonstrate that self-determination is not an exclusively Western concept. And that to the extent that it has a Western history and context, that even the emergence of things like social contract theory and the modern international order of states cannot be emptied out of the presence of Indigenous peoples and how our civilizations and political communities and our presence shaped and created the Western tradition. And second, while we can identify and take seriously colonizing moments in time and the concepts and the systems and the structures and the institutions that those moments give rise to, we can also consider what it means to think of those as temporal aberrations, to invert Rifkin's description of native peoples, where he describes native peoples as inscribed as temporal aberrations. We can actually think of colonization as a temporal aberration. Colonization as a set of events that are both located in past, are contemporary ongoing practices that delimit and foreclose certain kinds of Indigenous futures, but are also kind of like a blip on a millennia deep civilizations and knowledge systems. This doesn't mean that colonization doesn't have material power or that it doesn't exercise its ability to shape and constrain our lives as Indigenous peoples. We know that it does. We reckon with this every day. What it gives space for is to allow us to see that colonization is not the only thing going on. And it does not need to be the only focus of our attention in the pursuit of self-determination, which is grounded in a deep, deep history of Indigenous peoples and their social and political communities that far exceed the colonial moment. And it recovers, I think, also a serious intellectual space for us to take Indigenous agency seriously in the way that Táíwò and others call for us to do. Indigenous peoples, other colonised peoples are human agents who have navigated a complex constellation of the environment, moments of colonisation, change and adaptation in the face of material change. These are things that we have always done, irrespective of the changing determinations of others. And so finally, I'll return to kind of my training, I guess, as a political theorist, which is to say that I think thinking about complexity and temporality in relation to self-determination also generates new sites and new focal points for how we study Indigenous political life. This is to say, and I do think it has to be said in our academy today, that Indigenous politics cannot be reduced to the study of settler colonialism. I don't think it can be reduced even to studies of efforts to resist and resurge against settler colonialism. I don't think Indigenous politics can be reduced to the study of policy and governance, or to the study of institutions and the decisions of bureaucrats and politicians. Indigenous politics cannot be reduced to an analysis of conflict and contestation and efforts, failed or otherwise, for reconciliation. Indigenous politics, very simply, when we think about self-determination through complexity and temporality, we see that it simply cannot be reduced to any one thing. It encompasses a universe. And so to introduce complexity and temporality is to have us, among other things, take seriously the ways in which our disagreements over historical and structural conditions not only shape our present day lives, but also the types of futures we hope for and believe might be possible. And that our projects and our future making projects are not just located in the identification and resistance against those frameworks, but reminding ourselves that we have whole life worlds and whole universes that are grounded in millennia deep tradition, knowledge systems, place, relationship to country, that give us a set of tools and possibilities and opportunities that far exceed those parameters. And to wrap up and keep on time, what I'm really trying to drive towards is that there is a way of building new projects that look at Indigenous self-determination as this much more expansive, much more complex, much more contingent and uncertain project. But at its heart is the dislocation of the colonial present and the prioritisation of Indigenous agency in how we read this politics. So thank you very much for your attention. I had many, many more notes to go through, but I think that's enough for today. As I've said, it's early thinking. It's not a completed thesis. It's a kind of, I guess it's the beginning of thinking through a method or framework for a project that we will talk about in a later seminar in the year that a few of us on the team have put together. But for now, as a very early and generative moment in the process, I really welcome questions and reactions and criticisms and challenges to some of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof Sana. Please join me in thanking Prof Sana for a very thought-provoking presentation, and we certainly appreciate that it is a work in progress and it's emerging ideas, but this is the benefit of presenting at sessions like this to be able to generate some discussion. And I think my reflections on this is very much one of thinking in the aftermath of the failed referendum last year. It's so timely for us to reconsider the space, right, and reconceptualize it and reinvent it and bring that creative thinking and drawing from our disciplinary knowledge, but also what you bring to the table is just this real emergence of different ideas coming from other intellectual traditions as well, which is sort of throwing open some really creative thought processes. And I certainly took away from this, Prof Sana, that I said, you know, self-determination didn't emerge as a response to colonisation. And I thought, hey, man, like that was just a really timely reminder with the now more than ever Reconciliation Week and me contemplating and reflecting on that this week. So thank you very much for that reminder. I've certainly felt very imbued by those sentiments.